You have no use to me.
Please just come back. We can talk about this. Please come back. Don't do this here.
What happens when a Korean mafia heir, a man branded by his own mother's hand and trained since birth to destroy anything she could not control, walks into a boardroom and finds himself face to face with the woman he abandoned in a hospital bed? The same woman who has spent 10 months in silence, building something so precise and so devastating that by the time he understands what she has done, it is already done. Welcome to Black Diamond Stories. Make sure you subscribe and stay until the very end, because this one will change the way you think about power, patience, and what a woman is truly capable of when you leave her no other choice. The room at Cedars-Sinai smelled of stargazer lilies, expensive ones, the kind Han Seok-jin had his assistant order, because Han Seok-jin himself didn't do hospitals, didn't do mess, didn't do anything that reminded him he was capable of being human. Amara lay against the elevated bed, her deep mahogany skin still flushed and glistening from the battle her body had just survived. 14 hours of labor, of gripping rails, of breathing through pain that rewired something permanent inside her. Her hair, that full breathtaking crown that Han Seok-jin once buried his face in and called beautiful, was damp against her temples, coiling softly at the edges like it always did when she had been through something real. Her arms held two tiny boys, two perfect sleeping boys, their faces carrying the quiet miracle of two worlds made into one, her deep mahogany and his porcelain blended into something neither of them could have created alone. She looked up at him. She was still trying to smile. That was the part that would haunt her later. That even then, an IV still threading her arm, hospital gown still cold against her skin, body still trembling from the work of bringing life into the world, she was still reaching for something warm to give him, still hopping, still Amara, even at her most undone. Han Seok-jin stood at the foot of the bed in a charcoal suit, pressed to architectural precision, collar tight, cufflinks straight. He hadn't loosened a single thing. He hadn't moved toward the babies. His eyes, those dark, unreadable eyes she had once made the mistake of calling deep, moved slowly across her face, down her body, back up. The way a man looks at something that no longer serves him. The silence stretched like a wire pulled too tight. And Amara, razor-sharp Amara, who had rebuilt entire brand empires from scratch, who had walked into rooms full of powerful men and made them listen, who had chosen this man when she could have chosen anyone, felt herself shrink beneath that gaze in a way she hadn't since she was 17, and being told she wasn't enough. Say something, she thought. Please just say something. He did. You're unrecognizable, barely above a whisper. But in that sterile, lily-scented room, it landed like a verdict read aloud in court. A beat of silence followed that swallowed every other sound in the room, the hum of the monitors, the distant corridor noise, everything, until all that existed was the shape of what he had just said and the expression on Amara's face as she waited for him to take it back. He did not take it back. You're fat, Amara. His jaw barely moved. You're ugly. This, a slight cold gesture toward her, toward all of her, toward everything she had just sacrificed. This isn't the woman I married. He turned, walked to the door, paused, not from hesitation, she would understand later, but to make sure she heard every deliberate step, every inch of distance he chose. He wanted the sound of his leaving to be the thing she remembered. His final act of control, in a room where she had just done the most powerful thing a human body can do. The door clicked shut. The twins began to cry, and Amara sat there, completely still, holding his sons, her sons, and she let the words land. All of them, every syllable. She let them cut deep and carve out every soft, trusting place inside her that had ever believed he was safe. Then she looked down at those two sleeping faces, and something in her eyes went quiet. Not broken quiet, not defeated quiet, decided quiet. The kind of quiet that falls over a woman the moment she stops grieving and starts calculating. The kind that has no sound, no tears, no theatrics, just a cold, clear shift behind the eyes, like a door locking from the inside. She reached for the napkin on the bedside table and pressed it to her cheek. She kept it. She would need it later, not to cry into, as evidence. What she did not know in that moment, what she would not discover until much later, when she had the time and the clarity and the flash drive to understand the full architecture of what had been done to her, was that she had not been alone in that hospital room. Not entirely. There had been a woman watching the security feed from a private monitor 2 floors up. A woman in a white silk blouse and jade earrings who had arranged for those specific stargazer lilies, because she knew Amara was mildly allergic to them and had wanted her eyes swollen and her appearance diminished before Han Seok-jin arrived. A woman who had scripted those words, fat, ugly, and unrecognizable, and rehearsed them with her son the night before in the back of a car, while Amara was in active labor. Madame Han's son had not left anything to chance. She never did. She had watched the feed with her hands folded in her lap and her face holding the particular satisfaction of a woman who has executed a plan precisely as designed. She had watched her son deliver the words. She had watched him leave. She had watched Amara sit in the silence with those 2 babies. And she had felt, in that moment, that the matter was concluded. She had been wrong about that, but she would not know it for another 10 months. Amara survived the night by refusing to sleep. She sat in the hospital bed with the twins nestled in the bassinet beside her, their tiny chests rising and falling in the slow, trusting rhythm of new life. She watched them breathe. She counted every exhale like it was a prayer, like the act of witnessing them was the only thing keeping her tethered to the floor of her own sanity. The lilies on the windowsill had begun to wilt overnight. Nobody had come to replace them. Nobody had come at all. By morning, the light through the hospital window was gray and unconvinced, the kind of Lowe's Angel's light that forgot to be warm. Amara had already washed her face, already rebraided the edges of her hair with the comb from her overnight bag, already squared her shoulders against the pillow. She had not cried again. She had made that decision somewhere around 3 a.m, in the dark, with one son's hand wrapped around her finger, that she would not spend another tear in this room. This room that still smelled like his cologne, underneath the antiseptic. This room where he had looked at her like a receipt he wanted to dispute. She heard the knock at 8:47 in the morning. Not a nurse's knock, not the soft, apologetic rap of someone bringing breakfast or checking vitals. This knock had authority in it, the kind of knock that already knew it was unwelcome and didn't care. A man in a gray suit entered, young, precise, carrying a leather portfolio with the kind of practiced neutrality that told her he had delivered bad news before and considered it a skill. He set the portfolio on the edge of her bed without asking permission, opened it, and slid a document toward her the way you'd slide something across a table to someone you considered beneath negotiation. Annulment papers. Her eyes moved across the words with the same terrible clarity she had felt at 3 a.m. Fraudulent representation, material misrepresentation of intent, petition filed. She checked the date stamped at the top, 14 days ago. 14 days. He had filed while she was still pregnant, while she was still in their Silver Lake home, sleeping in their bed, believing, God, she had still been believing that the distance in him was stress, that the coldness was the company, that the man she married was still in there somewhere underneath the weight of his family's expectations. He had been filing paperwork. She set the document down very carefully, the way you set down something you intend to pick back up under completely different circumstances. The man in the gray suit was explaining the asset freeze, the Silver Lake property, the joint accounts. Her name removed from everything with the surgical efficiency of someone who had prepared for this moment long before she had. He used words like pursuant and accordingly, and as stipulated, and Amara sat there with her spine perfectly straight, and her face giving him absolutely nothing while inside her chest. Something that had once been soft completed its final transformation into iron. She didn't sign. She closed the portfolio, slid it back across the bed, and looked at him with eyes that had aged 10 years overnight. "Tell him," she said quietly, "that I read every word." The man blinked, clearly expecting tears or argument or desperation. He got none of those things. He got Amara James in a hospital gown, 2 days postpartum with nothing left to lose, and a mind that was already 3 moves ahead of everyone in the building. He left. She reached for the cup of hospital coffee on her tray. Cheap, burnt, nothing like the single origin pour-overs that had appeared on her kitchen counter every morning for 3 years. She wrapped both hands around the cup, felt the thin cardboard flex under her grip, and she drank it, all of it, because this was her life now, stripped down. Cheap coffee in cold rooms and legal documents delivered without eye contact, and she was going to drink every bitter drop of it and use it as fuel. She looked at her sons. Their eyes were still closed, still trusting, still untouched by the machinery of the world that had already decided their value before they had drawn their first real breath. Not on my watch, she thought. She reached for her phone, the one asset his lawyers had apparently overlooked, and she opened a blank note. She titled it one word, everything, and she began to write. The discharge process took 4 hours longer than it should have. No car had been sent, no assistant, no arrangement of any kind from Han Seok-jin's side. Just the quiet, humiliating confirmation that she had already been erased from the calendar of his life, with the same efficiency he applied to quarterly projections. Amara stood at the hospital entrance in the clothes her best friend Imani had rushed over that morning. A black wrap dress, her edges laid, her posture a declaration, with one son in a car seat carrier and one in her arms and a duffel bag hanging from her shoulder that contained the total physical sum of what she currently owned. She had called 3 car services. 2 of her cards declined. The third went through on the last $43 of a personal account Han Seok-jin hadn't found yet. The Lowe's Angels air outside was thick with heat and exhaust, and the indifferent glamour of a city that kept moving regardless of what you were surviving. She stood on the curb and breathed it in, all of it, and she did not allow herself the luxury of feeling small. That was when she felt the shadow. He materialized from the side of the building, the way men trained in surveillance always did, not from behind, not from the front, but from the peripheral edge of vision, the blind spot, the place you instinctively trust. Large, still, dressed in civilian clothes, but carrying himself with the posture of a man who had spent years making himself invisible in dangerous rooms. Kwon Tae, Han Seok-jin's head of personal security for 6 years. A man Amara had seen exactly 43 times in 3 years of marriage and exchanged perhaps 60 words with in total. He had always watched her the way a man watches something precious that belongs to someone who doesn't deserve it. He stopped beside her, did not look at her directly. "There's a car 2 blocks north," he said, his voice low and level as still water. "Gray sedan. Keys are on the front left tire." Amara looked at him. Why? He reached into his jacket and produced a flash drive, matte black, no markings, and held it at his side, below eyeline, the way you pass something in a room you know is being watched. "Because I've been watching that family for 6 years," he said, "and I'm done being the man who looks the other way." She took it, slipped it into the pocket of her wrap dress without breaking her posture, without changing her expression, without doing anything that might register on a camera as a transaction. "The drive contains offshore account records," Kwon Tae continued, eyes forward. 14 accounts the Han family board doesn't know about, shell companies routed through Singapore and Dubai, and 1 file. He paused, the pause of a man choosing his next words with the care of someone who knows they cannot be taken back. That explains why Han Seok-jin had that tattoo branded on his neck at 23. Amara's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The tattoo. She had asked about it once, early in their relationship, her fingers tracing the Korean characters on the side of his neck in the early morning dark. He had said it was personal. She had accepted that because she had believed there were rooms in a person you waited to be invited into. What does it mean? She asked. Kwon Ti finally looked at her. His eyes held the particular weight of a man who has carried someone else's shame for too long. It means unrepentant, he said, but it wasn't a choice. It was a branding. His mother's board required it as a right of loyalty. Any personal attachment deemed a threat to the family bloodline had to be publicly severed. He let that land. You were the third. The third, not the first woman Han Seok-jin had been forced to discard, not an accident, a pattern, a machine built to consume and expel anything his mother couldn't control. There is something else, Kwon Ti said, something that is not on the drive because it cannot be documented. He paused. Madame Han was in this building last night. She watched the security feed from a room 2 floors above yours. She had those lilies sent specifically because she knew about your allergy. She wanted you swollen and diminished before Han Seok-jin arrived. Amara was very still. The words he said to you, Kwon Ti continued. She scripted them. He practiced them in the car the night before while you were in labor. The silence between them was dense and absolute. Then Amara said quietly, "Does she know about my grandfather's investment?" Kwon Ti looked at her with something that was not quite surprised, but was the closest thing to it she had ever seen on his face. How do you know about that? I don't yet, she said, but I will. She was already walking north before he could respond. The loft was on the 6th floor of a converted industrial building in downtown Los Angeles, the kind of neighborhood that hadn't decided yet whether it was becoming something or returning to ruin. It smelled of old concrete and dry air, and the particular silence of a space that had been empty long enough to forget what it was waiting for. Amara stood in the center of it the first night with the twins asleep in the one-bedroom, the city throwing dim orange light through the high factory windows, and she turned slowly in the dark like a woman taking the full measure of her new kingdom. Bare walls, exposed pipes, a kitchen with 3 utensils and a single pot. She stood in the dark and she let herself feel all of it, the stripped-down reality of $43, 2 infants, and a flash drive that was either her salvation or a trap. She stood there until the feeling wasn't unbearable anymore, until it was simply information. Then she opened her laptop. She worked for 6 hours that first night, twins asleep, the city humming below her. She wasn't working from grief. She was working from architecture, building something with the precision of a woman who understood that the most devastating structures are the ones nobody sees coming. The persona emerged the way great things do, not invented but excavated. She had always been the architect behind other people's brands, the intelligence behind campaigns that made careers, the eye that saw what a company needed before the company knew it was missing. She had done it for others for 7 years. Now she was doing it for herself. She called herself V, no last name, no face, no photographs. V operated exclusively through encrypted communication, referrals only, a waiting list that grew purely on the strength of results. She wasn't selling image, she was selling transformation, and she knew exactly what that cost because she was paying it herself in real time. Every morning she rose before the twins and she ran. Not to punish her body, she had made peace with her body the second night in the loft, standing in front of the bathroom mirror and telling herself plainly that she was extraordinary, but to fortify it. Her deep brown skin caught the early Los Angeles sun on those morning runs through the arts district, her natural hair pulled back and coiling at the nape, her stride lengthening with every week that passed. Her face hardening into something that was still beautiful, but now carried an edge that hadn't been there before, an edge that said, I know exactly who I am. Do you know who you are dealing with? By month 3, V had 4 clients. By month 5, 8. By month 7, the name was circulating in the kind of rooms where power went to confirm itself, spoken in the low, careful voices of people who protected good intelligence like currency. Nobody knew she was a black woman from Los Angeles who had been served annulment papers while holding newborns. Nobody knew she was building an empire out of the wreckage of a man's cruelty. Nobody knew yet. She kept the flash drive in a fireproof case beneath the floor panel under the kitchen sink. She had reviewed every file on it within the first week. She understood now the full architecture of the Han family's hidden wealth, the accounts, the shell structures, the routing patterns. She understood the tattoo. She understood the pattern of women before her. The first had been a Chinese architect, Han Seokjin, had been involved with at 21. A woman who had disappeared from his life so completely that even her name was absent from every social record connected to him. The second had been a Korean-American attorney 7 years ago who had left Los Angeles within 3 months of the relationship ending and had never publicly explained why. 3 women, 3 removals, each one cleaner than the last. Madame Han had been perfecting her method. But she had never encountered a woman who kept receipts. And Amara understood something else now, something that Han Seokjin did not yet know she understood. Her grandfather, the man who had taught her chess at 6 and told her the board always told the truth, had been a silent equity partner in the Han Group Series A funding round 19 years ago, a round Madame Han had engineered, a round that had been the foundation of everything the company became. The partnership had never been dissolved. It had been buried, restructured, moved through 4 different legal entities over 2 decades. But it was there, intact, legally unimpeachable. 40% of the company's founding equity held in trust for the direct blood heirs of James Whitfield's family line. She pressed her fingers to her mouth, and she breathed, and she did not allow herself to cry because the thing moving through her was not grief. It was gratitude and fury and the absolute, crystalline certainty that she was ready. She closed her laptop at 2 in the morning, and in the orange, dark quiet of her loft, she smiled for the first time since the hospital. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of a woman who has just realized the game was never over. It was only beginning. Han Seokjin was losing. Not publicly. Publicly, he was still the cold, composed heir to the Han Group empire, still photographed in the right rooms, still quoted in the right publications. But behind the glass walls of the Han Group's 32nd floor war room, the cracks were visible to anyone paying attention, and his mother, Madame Han, paid attention to everything. She sat at the head of the conference table the way she always sat, spine rigid, hands folded, dressed in charcoal silk that matched the steel of her expression. Around her, analysts presented numbers that told a story she refused to accept. The IPO was struggling. Investor confidence was eroding. The public narrative around Han Seokjin had shifted from visionary to cold-blooded, a word that kept appearing in media coverage with the particular persistence of a truth trying to surface. It had started with an anonymous tip to a financial journalist. Nothing provable, just a thread, a whisper that the Han heir had abandoned a wife and children under legally questionable circumstances. The annulment filing was public record. Someone had found it and known exactly what to do with it. Madame Han had looked across the table at her son that morning, and for the first time she had seen something in his face she had not anticipated. Doubt. Not about the company, not about the strategy. Doubt about her. A hairline fracture in the foundation of the absolute authority she had maintained over him since before he could read. She had seen it in the slight tension at the corner of his jaw, the way his eyes moved to the window and stayed there a moment too long. She had filed that observation away like a weapon, and she had gone home that evening and made 2 phone calls. The first was to the family lawyer. She wanted the annulment expedited, the documentation tightened, every legal thread connecting Han Seokjin to Amara James cut so cleanly that no journalist and no court would find a loose end worth pulling. The second call was to a private intelligence firm she had used 3 times before. She gave them a name. She gave them a description. She said, find her, and she said, tell me everything, and she said, do it quietly. What Madame Han did not know, could not know, was that the woman she was trying to locate had already located her. Han Seokjin sat now in his private office, the Lowe's Angels skyline indifferent and glittering below him. He had loosened his collar, a small thing, but Han Seokjin never loosened his collar during business hours. His assistant had brought him 3 different reports, and he had read none of them. He was sitting with a glass of water that had gone warm and a mind that kept returning, against his discipline, against all his training, to the same image. Her face. Not as he had left it in the hospital. That image he had packaged and stored in the part of himself he did not examine. The image that kept returning uninvited was earlier. Amara in their Silver Lake kitchen on a Tuesday morning, standing barefoot on the cold marble in one of his shirts, reading something on her tablet with the focused, private intensity she had when she thought no one was watching. Not performing, not presenting, just existing in a way that had always made the room feel like it had a center. He picked up his water, set it down. His head of communications knocked and entered in the same motion, which meant it was urgent. She placed a single printed page on his desk, a profile. No photograph, just a name and a record of results that read like a masterclass in strategic reinvention. V-Image and Brand Architecture, by referral only. The board wants her, his communications head said. 3 of our biggest potential investors have used her in the last 6 months. She's rebuilt 2 failing public images and turned them into assets. She doesn't do interviews, she doesn't do press, she doesn't even do in-person meetings until the 3rd consultation. Han Seokjin looked at the paper. Who is she? Nobody knows. That's part of it. A pause. The board is saying she's the only person who can reframe your narrative before the IPO closes. Han Seokjin read the results again, the precision of them, the intelligence embedded in every move documented on that single page. Not just image management, but psychological repositioning, the kind that required understanding not just how the public saw something, but why they needed to see it differently. He had known only one person who thought that way. He dismissed the thought before it finished forming. Set up the consultation, he said. What he did not know was that across the city, in a converted industrial loft in downtown Lowe's Angels, a woman in a red silk robe had just received a notification that the Han Group had made an inquiry through her agency's encrypted portal. She had been waiting for this specific notification for 6 weeks. She had known it was coming because she had arranged for it to come, had engineered a whisper campaign through 3 of her clients that had placed V's name in exactly the right conversations at exactly the right time. She had laid the bread trail, and she had waited, and now the thing she had built was exactly where she needed it to be. She accepted the inquiry. She set the start date for 3 weeks out, which was 4 weeks before the IPO. Then she went to check on her sons. The penthouse was on the 44th floor of a building that didn't have a public address. Han Seokjin had received the consultation details through 3 layers of intermediary, a number, a time, a dress code that simply read no recording devices, and he had followed every instruction without question, which was itself a thing he did not do for anyone. He told himself it was strategy. He told himself he was simply doing what the board required. He did not examine why his pulse had shifted the moment the elevator doors opened. The space beyond was dim and deliberate, low amber lighting, the kind that made everything look like a secret. The furniture was severe and elegant, dark wood, clean lines. Nothing decorative except a single shelf of architectural models along the far wall that told him immediately the person who owned this space thought in structures, in systems, in the long game. A mesh screen divided the room, sheer enough to suggest a silhouette, opaque enough to deny confirmation. Behind it, a figure sat with the composed stillness of someone who had long ago stopped needing to perform authority because they had become it. A woman's voice came through the room, low and unhurried, modulated just enough to strip accent and geography from it. Mr. Han, you're 4 minutes early. I prefer to be. I know, she said. I read that about you. I also read that you prefer control to comfort, legacy to loyalty, and that you've fired 3 communications directors in 18 months. A pause that it edges. I don't get fired. Han Seok-jin settled into the chair across from the screen, his spine straight, his hands resting open on his knees in the posture of a man who wanted to appear relaxed and understood he was failing. The board says you're the only person who can reframe my public narrative before the IPO. The board is correct. No arrogance in it. Just fact delivered the way weather is delivered. But I don't reframe narratives, Mr. Han. I excavate the truth underneath the damage and I rebuild from the foundation. That means you have to be honest with me about the damage. Behind the screen, Amara held her glass with both hands and breathed with the slow, measured rhythm of a woman who had rehearsed this exact moment for 7 months. She had designed this room, this lighting, this chair placement, every detail calculated to put him in the psychological position of a man who was being evaluated rather than served. She had learned that from him, actually, from watching the way he arranged power in rooms when he thought she was only watching the view. Now she was the view, and she controlled everything he could and couldn't see. Tell me about your greatest mistake, she said. The air in the room shifted. Han Seok-jin's eyes moved to the screen and stayed there. The amber light caught the angular lines of his face, the jaw, the cheekbone, the careful blankness he wore like armor. But something moved underneath it, something that didn't have a name in the language he used for business. I've made decisions that were not entirely my own, he said. That caused harm to people who did not deserve it. That is not an answer, she said. That is a legal disclaimer rehearsed to sound like honesty. She let the silence hold for a moment that was almost uncomfortable. Try again. His jaw tightened. There was a woman, he said finally. My wife. His voice had none of its usual precision. It moved carefully, the way someone moves through a room in the dark. She loved me in a way I hadn't been taught to receive. And instead of learning how to receive it, I allowed myself to be weaponized against her. Aloud, Amara said, that's a very careful word. It is the most honest word I have. Where is she now? He looked at the screen with the particular focus of a man staring at something he cannot see but can feel the shape of. I don't know, he said, and that is the thing I live with. Behind the screen, Amara set her glass down with a steadiness that should have been impossible given what was moving through her chest. She sat with perfect posture in the dim amber dark, and she breathed, and she thought about the napkin in the fireproof case under her kitchen sink. Very well, she said. Come back Thursday. Bring every piece of press coverage from the last 8 months. And Mr. Han, she paused. Don't misrepresent yourself to me again. I always know. He left without asking how she would know. He should have asked. Thursday came and went. Then a second Thursday. Then a third. By the 4th meeting, Han Seok-jin was arriving 15 minutes early and waiting in the lobby with his jacket unbuttoned and his phone face down on his knee, which his security team had never seen him do in 11 years. The consultations had evolved into something that neither of them was nomming. Amara, SV, behind her screen, her voice modulated, her identity intact, had begun to understand that dismantling Han Seok-jin's public image problem required first dismantling the architecture of the man himself. And the man himself, she was discovering with slow, nauseating precision, was not entirely what his mother had built. There were fractures in the construction of Han Seok-jin that Madam Han didn't know about. He had given $3 million anonymously to a women's shelter network in Seoul 2 years ago. Amara found it in the financial records on the drive, buried in the shell structures beside the ugliness, a single clean transaction that didn't fit the pattern of everything around it. She had stared at it for a long time. She had not softened, but she had noted it. What Amara was also nodding, with the careful peripheral attention of a woman who had learned to watch everything, was the other set of meetings happening in that same building, 3 floors below the penthouse, in a suite she had rented under a shell company 6 weeks earlier. Amara's legal team had been quietly assembling the case against Madame Han, not against the company, not against Han Seokjin, against the woman herself, against the scripted words and the deliberate lilies and the private intelligence firm she had deployed, against the offshore accounts that bore not Han Seokjin's signature, but hers, against the board resolutions that had been drafted not in the Han Group offices, but in Madame Han's private residence, executed in the early morning hours before her son arrived each day, presented to him as consensus when they were in fact unilateral decisions dressed in collective clothing. Madame Han was not a supporting character in this story. She was the author of it, and Amara intended to make that undeniable. The intelligence firm Madame Han had hired to find Amara had reported back 3 weeks earlier. No trace. V was a ghost. The loft was registered to a shell company. The agency had no physical address. Madame Han had received this report with the particular stillness of a woman who knew that untraceable things are never truly untraceable. They are simply not yet found. She redoubled the search. She also, in a move that revealed more about her than she understood, made a second tactical error. She reached out through intermediaries to 2 of V's existing clients, a tech founder and a media executive, and attempted, carefully and plausibly, to plant doubt, suggesting that V's methods were legally questionable, suggesting that the anonymity was not discretion, but concealment, suggesting that perhaps V's clients should ask harder questions. Both clients contacted Amara immediately. She received those calls, and she said nothing except, "Thank you for telling me." And then she added Madame Han's interference to the file she was building, documented with timestamps and phone records, and the affidavits of 2 witnesses who had no reason to protect the Han family and every reason to be honest. The file was now 340 pages. Amara had titled it the same thing she had titled the first note she made in her hospital bed on $43 worth of borrowed time. Everything. In their 5th meeting, the amber room had shifted into something charged and unresolved, the way air shifts before weather. Amara asked Han Seokjin to walk her through the day of the annulment filing. She asked it flatly, without preamble, in the middle of what had seemed like a routine review of his communication strategy. Han Seokjin was quiet for a longer time than she had ever heard from him. "I was told it was necessary," he said finally, "to protect the company during the IPO window, that a contested marriage creates legal vulnerability." "Who told you?" His pause was its own answer. "She told you," Amara said. He did not confirm it. He did not need to. "In the words you said in the hospital room," she said, keeping her voice perfectly level against the thing clawing at the underside of her composure. "Were those also told to you?" The silence that followed was the longest silence the room had ever held. "Yes," he said. It was one syllable. It cost him something visible. She could see it in the shift of his shoulders, the way his hands, resting on his knees, pressed downward slightly as if bracing against impact. One syllable that rewrote the architecture of the betrayal entirely. Because there is a specific and devastating difference between a man who wounds you from his own cruelty and a man who is handed a weapon by his mother and aimed at you like a gun. Both are culpable, but only one of them has a mother in the room. "You practiced them," Amara said the night before. "It was in the car." Han Seokjin's head came up. And in that moment, in the quality of his stillness, the way his eyes fixed on the screen with an intensity that was suddenly, acutely focused, she understood that he did not know that she knew this. That this was information he had no framework for her possessing. That the controlled, anonymous consultant behind the mesh screen had just revealed a crack in her own concealment without meaning to. She watched him process it. She watched him turn it over. "How do you know that?" he said. His voice had changed. The boardroom precision was gone entirely. What was underneath it was rawer and more dangerous. A man at the edge of understanding something that would change everything. I know a great deal about the Han family, she said carefully. That is why your board hired me. And he looked at the screen for a long moment. Then he said, Who are you? The question landed in the room and stayed there, suspended between them in the amber light like something that, once answered, could not be taken back. I am V, she said, and she let that be enough for that night. He left differently than he had left the other meetings. He left with the focused, contained energy of a man who has understood that a question he thought he was asking in one direction is actually pointing somewhere else entirely. He left, and Amara sat in the dark after the elevator doors closed, and she pressed her hands flat on the table, and she breathed and she told herself, Not yet, not yet. 4 more days. 4 more days until the IPO board presentation. 4 more days until the room. She had one thing left to do before then. She needed to speak to Madame Han. Not in the boardroom, not through legal channels, not through the buffer of strategy or documentation or the clean architecture of a public unmasking. Alone. She arranged it through Kwon Ti, who was still, technically, employed by the Han family, and who had been, for the last 10 months, quietly and methodically documenting everything he witnessed on behalf of a woman whose name he never said aloud in that building. Madame Han received the request for a private meeting from a representative of V's agency. She agreed to it with the speed of a woman who had been trying to find this person for months and understood that the meeting coming to her meant something had shifted. She chose the location, her private residence in Bel Air, a house designed to communicate the full weight of Han family legacy to anyone who entered it. Marble floors, art that cost more than most people's buildings, a garden that was more architecture than nature. She wanted Amara off balance. She did not know she was inviting Amara home. Amara arrived in black, not the performative black of mourning, but the precise, deliberate black of a woman who has made a decision and dressed accordingly. Her natural hair was down and full around her face. Her deep brown skin carried the particular luminosity of someone who has come through fire and is no longer afraid of heat. She carried nothing except a single manila envelope and the 340-page understanding of exactly who she was walking into a room with. Madame Han received her in the sitting room. She was impeccable, as always, jade earrings, white blouse, the posture of a woman who had never once in her adult life been in a room where she didn't believe she held the most power. She looked at Amara, and she did something that told Amara everything she needed to know about what the next 4 days would require. She smiled, not warmly, the way a chess player smiles when they believe they can see the whole board and you cannot. You're younger than I imagined, Madame Han said, and you've kept yourself well. Amara sat down across from her, without being invited to, and placed the manila envelope on the table between them, and left her hand resting on top of it. I want you to understand something, Amara said, before I tell you what's in this envelope. I am not here to negotiate with you. I am not here to warn you. I am here to give you the professional courtesy of knowing, before Thursday, what is coming. Because unlike you, I do not believe in blindsiding people in rooms designed to humiliate them. A pause. I believe in doing it with witnesses. Madame Han's smile remained, but something behind her eyes recalibrated. You're the wife, she said. I am the mother of your grandsons, Amara said, and I am the CEO of the company you built your legacy on. Those 2 facts are about to become public knowledge simultaneously. I wanted you to have one night to decide how you would like to respond to them. She stood. She left the envelope on the table. She walked out of that house and down that driveway and into the car that was waiting, and she did not look back. The envelope she left behind contained nothing, except a single sheet of paper with one sentence on it. The board meeting is at 9. Be there. The morning of the IPO board presentation, Amara was awake before 4. She dressed in the dark, slowly and deliberately, the way a soldier puts on armor. A blood-red suit tailored to the precise measurements of the body she had rebuilt from the inside out, structured at the shoulder, nipped at the waist, cut to communicate that the woman inside it had decided something, and the decision was final. Her natural hair was styled and lifted in a full crown that caught light from every angle, framing a face that was stunning in the way rare things are stunning. Not decorative, but significant. Her skin, deep and clear and gleaming, held the particular luminosity of a woman who had fought through something real and come out the other side more herself. She looked in the mirror for exactly 10 seconds. Then she picked up her portfolio and walked out the door. The boardroom was on the 31st floor, and it was full. Investors, board members, legal teams, the financial press permitted in for the opening of the presentation as a calculated show of transparency. Madame Han sat at the far end of the table in a white suit that was meant to signal purity and communicated instead the particular coldness of a woman who had spent decades confusing control with love. She was already there when Amara arrived. Their eyes met across the length of the room. Madame Han's face held perfectly. She was extraordinary at this, at absorbing information that threatened her and returning nothing that could be used against her. She had spent 50 years building that face, and she wore it now like a final piece of armor. Han Seok-jin stood at the head of the room near the presentation screen, composed and precisely dressed, doing what he always did in public, performing the version of himself his mother had manufactured. He did not see Amara come in. The representative from V's agency announced simply that the image consultant had arrived and wished to open the presentation with a brief strategic overview. Several board members exchanged glances. This was not on the agenda. Madame Han's chin lifted by a precise and dangerous millimeter. Then Amara walked through the door. She did not hurry. She did not look around the room for reactions. She moved to the front with the steady, unhurried authority of a woman who had earned the right to take up space and knew it, her portfolio under one arm, her head high, her red suit a declaration against every gray and navy surface in the room. Han Seok-jin heard the change in the room before he processed it, a collective shift in atmosphere, the kind that happens when something significant enters a space. He turned. The glass he was holding slipped from his fingers. It did not shatter. It bounced once on the thick carpet and rolled to a stop. Nobody moved to retrieve it. Nobody moved at all. Amara set her portfolio on the table. She looked at him for the first time in 10 months with nothing between them. No screen, no voice modulation, no architecture of concealment, just her face and his, and every consequence of the thing he had said in a hospital room suspended in the air between them like a held breath. "I believe I was hired to present this company's public image strategy," she said, addressing the room, her voice carrying to every corner without effort. "So let's begin." She opened the presentation. The first slide was not a financial projection. It was a date, a time, a location. Cedars-Sinai Medical Center, room 417, 10 months ago. The second slide was a still image taken from hospital security footage, timestamp visible, resolution sharp. Han Seok-jin in his charcoal suit standing at the foot of a bed. And in that bed, a woman in a hospital gown holding 2 newborns, looking up at the man she had married with an expression that the entire room recognized immediately, because every person in it had either worn that expression or been the reason someone else had. Madame Han stood up. She rose from her chair at the far end of the table with the speed and precision of a woman who had spent 50 years controlling rooms, and every eye in the boardroom moved to her in that single instant. The investors, the legal teams, the press, all of them watching, all of them waiting. "Sit down," Amara said. Her voice did not rise. It did not need to. "We're not finished." Madame Han held her position for one long beat, long enough for the entire room to see that she had heard the instruction and was calculating whether to comply. Then, slowly, with the rigid deliberateness of a woman choosing her next move in a game she was no longer certain she controlled, she sat. The footage played. It played without audio because it didn't need audio. It played in the boardroom of a company preparing to go public with the global financial press in the room. And every person watching it understood with absolute certainty what they were seeing. The room was the quietest thing Amara had ever been inside. She let it be quiet for exactly as long as it needed to be. Then she advanced to the next slide. "This is the trust documentation," she said, her voice even and precise, "establishing a 40% founding equity stake held by my grandfather James Whitfield in the Han Group's Series A round." She paused. "These are my sons." She showed a photograph. Two small, perfect boys, now 10 months old, with their father's bone structure and their mother's eyes. They are the direct blood heirs of that trust, which makes them, as of this morning, significant equity holders in this company. She advanced again. "These are the 14 offshore accounts maintained by the Han family through shell entities in Singapore, Dubai, and Luxembourg." She looked at the board members, slowly, one by one. "Your fiduciary obligation to investigate these accounts began the moment this information was filed with the regulatory authority this morning at 7:45. She advanced one final time. "And this," she said, "is a communication log, time-stamped phone records, 2 witness affidavits, and a detailed account of the private intelligence firm engaged by Madame Han to locate and suppress the mother of her son's children, after she had already ensured her son's desertion through scripted dialogue, deliberate allergen exposure, and assets stripped under fraudulent annulment claims." She closed her portfolio. "This is not a public image problem," she said quietly. "This is a governance crisis with a documented human cost, and the woman who designed it is sitting at the end of this table." The room turned. Madame Han stood at the far end in her white suit, and she was, for the first time in 50 years of boardrooms, completely alone in a room full of people who had just understood what she was. Her composure held. It was extraordinary. The discipline of a woman who had built a fortress from sheer will and was not going to allow it to fall in front of witnesses. She looked at Amara with the eyes of a woman recalculating, rerouting, finding another path even now. "My son will not support this," she said. Her voice was controlled and certain. "He is loyal to this family. He always has been." The room waited. Han Seok-jin had not moved since Amara had entered. He stood at the head of the table, and he had watched the footage, and he had seen the communication logs, and he had looked at the photograph of his sons, and he was standing now with the particular stillness of a man from whom every manufactured thing has been removed, and what is left is simply a person having to decide, in front of everyone, who they actually are. His mother looked at him. The weight of decades was in that look. The full accumulated architecture of everything she had built in him, the loyalty, the discipline, the reflexive deference, the brand that read unrepentant on his neck, all of it pressing down on this single moment, demanding the answer it had always received before. Han Seok-jin looked at his mother for a long time. Then he looked at Amara. "What I said to you in that hospital room," he said, and the room was so quiet that every person in it heard every word, "was not a decision I made freely." He paused. "But it was a decision I allowed, and there's no architecture of explanation that makes that anything other than what it was." He looked at his mother. "You scripted those words," he said quietly. "You arranged for her to be diminished before I arrived. You filed the annulment on my behalf before I had agreed to it." He stopped. "You have done this before, to other women. And I have told myself each time that I did not know, that I was not responsible, that loyalty meant trusting your judgment even when something in me knew the judgment was wrong." He picked up the document Amara had placed on the table. He looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at his mother again. And what was in his eyes was not anger. It was something quieter and more permanent than anger. It was the final closing of a door. "I'm done being the weapon," he said. Madame Han's composure fractured then, not all at once. It came apart in layers, the way stone comes apart under sustained and precise pressure, first the surface, then the structure beneath. What was underneath was not softness. There was no softness in Madame Han. What was underneath was the face of a woman who has organized her entire existence around a single point of control and is watching that point dissolve in real time. She looked at Amara with something that was almost recognition. Then she straightened her jacket, picked up her bag, and she walked out of that boardroom with her spine perfectly straight because Madame Han would not give a room the satisfaction of watching her collapse. But just before she reached the door, she slowed, barely perceptibly, and in that slowing the room saw it, one unguarded moment where the architecture of 50 years of iron self-possession gave way to something underneath it that looked, for just a fraction of a second, like a woman who had built everything she had on the wrong foundation and had just, in this room, in front of these witnesses, finally understood that it was gone. Then she walked out. And Amara, watching her go, felt something she had not expected to feel in this moment. Not triumph, clarity, because watching Madame Han leave that room was not the satisfying implosion she had imagined for 10 months. It was smaller and more human than that. It was a woman who had spent her life confusing love with leverage, walking out of a room that no longer recognized her authority. And there was something in that, not sympathy. She was not there yet, perhaps would never be, but something that acknowledged the particular tragedy of a person who built everything they had on the wrong foundation. Amara turned back to the room. She had a company to run. The document Han Seok-jin had picked up was signed by the end of business, not under duress, not in the wreckage of a public moment, but later, in a smaller room, with legal teams and a quietness that felt different from the boardroom silence. He signed it with the focused, deliberate attention of a man who has made a decision that is costing him something real and has decided the cost is right. Amara watched him sign it. She stood across the table in her red suit with her portfolio closed and her hands still and her face giving him nothing, because this was not a moment for warmth. Warmth had to be built from nothing, and they were still at nothing. But she watched him, and she noted, with the same careful peripheral attention she had applied to everything, that his hands were steady. A man whose hands are steady when signing away his empire is not performing. She filed that away, not as forgiveness, as data. 6 months later, the Santa Monica Pier caught the last light of a Sunday evening and turned it gold. Amara sat on the private balcony of a house that was hers, not gifted, not shared, not borrowed against someone else's legacy, but earned with every pre-dawn run and every encrypted consultation, and every hour she had spent in a loft in downtown Los Angeles, building something out of nothing while 2 small boys slept in the next room and trusted her completely. The twins were at her feet, chasing each other in that new and marvelous way of toddlers who have just discovered legs, their laughter carrying on the ocean air like proof of something. She held a glass of wine, and she watched them and she breathed. The gate at the bottom of the property clicked. She did not turn around immediately. She already knew his footsteps, had known them for 3 years, and had spent 10 months learning to hear them differently, as the sound of someone who no longer had the right to walk into a room and rearrange it. He was not in a charcoal suit. He wore plain clothes, the kind a man wears when he has stopped using his wardrobe as a statement of dominance. He had been working at a community center in East Los Angeles for the last 5 months, not publicized, not documented, not performed for anyone. Kwon T had mentioned it once in passing, and Amara had said nothing, and had thought about it for 3 days. He stopped at the gate. He did not presume to open it. The boys saw him. They did not know exactly what they were looking at, but some ancient cellular knowledge stirred in them at the sight of that face, and the older of the 2 pulled himself upright against the balcony rail and stared with his father's bone structure and his mother's absolute directness. Amara looked at Han Seok-jin across the distance of the gate. "You said I was ugly," she said. Her voice was quiet and carried no performance. "Look at what I built from the ashes of your insults." Han Seokjin stood at the gate, and he did not flinch from what she was saying. He stood still and received it with the open-handed acceptance of someone who had accepted they had no right to ask for anything different. "I know," he said. "You can hold them," she said. "For an hour. I'll be inside." She picked up her wine and she walked through the balcony doors, the ocean breeze lifting the edges of her hair, her spine straight and her steps unhurried. She stood in the kitchen and she finished her wine and she looked at the fireproof case under the sink where the flash drive still sat. And then she looked at something she had placed beside it 3 weeks ago, something she had only just received, a letter from her grandfather's attorney sent in connection with the trust settlement. She had read it 4 times. In it, the attorney explained that James Whitfield had documented his Han Group investment immediately after Amara began dating Han Seokjin, that he had structured the trust specifically and deliberately in the event that the relationship produced children, that he had written a note included with the letter in his own handwriting on a single sheet of paper. She had that note now. She kept it folded inside the fireproof case next to the flash drive and the napkin. It said, "I taught you chess for a reason, baby girl. I always knew you'd need the long game. The board was yours before he ever sat down." Outside, she could hear her son's voices, and beneath them, lower and more careful, the voice of a man learning how to be something other than what he was built to be. She did not rush back out. She was not punishing him. She was simply clear about what this was and what it was not. He was the man who had fathered her sons. He was not, and might never be, the man who came back in from the cold. That was his work to do and her decision to make, and it would happen on her timeline, or it would not happen at all. She had her children. She had her empire. She had her grandfather's letter and her grandmother's nerve, and the absolute, unshakable knowledge that the most dangerous thing you can do to a woman built like Amara James is underestimate her, because she will let you, right up until the moment she doesn't. If you made it to the end of this story, you already know exactly what Amara was made of. Now tell me honestly, do you think she gave Han Seokjin too much standing at that gate, or did she give him exactly what he earned? And Madam Han, do you believe she truly understood what she lost in that boardroom, or is she already in a car somewhere planning her next move? Drop your thoughts in the comments right now because this story is not over. The Han family still has chapters that have not been opened yet, and when they open, Amara will already be 3 moves ahead. Subscribe to Black Diamond Stories and stay with us. We are just getting started.